floor is yours.
Awesome. Well, first of all, we want to thank you for allowing us this opportunity. We're really thrilled to be here. The students have expressed a lot of interest. I'm one of the ASP directors. I'm Shariah. It's down here. They've expressed a lot of interest in modern day Islam, so they should have questions for you. It'd be really nice maybe just to give a little background about yourself to some of the students, because they may not know too much, so that would be maybe a good place to start.
Me?
Maybe Saeed can do it for you. He's your student. Saeed wrote the bio for you, right?
Which bio?
The bio for the Encyclopedia of Modern Muslims or something like that, or top 100 Muslims of the world. Well, I don't know, I remember what was the...
It's the Encyclopedia of the American Muslim History in the United States. So, written the entry about it says, well, shall I...
I mean, there's no... I'm not a big fan of labels. I'm a student of Islam, and that's enough. Other than that, you can form your own opinions about what I am or what I am. There's a lot of information about me in public venues that you can read. You can believe whatever you want. It doesn't make any difference to me.
Can we go around the room?
Talking about me is boring.
Maybe we can go around the room and like everyone can introduce themselves and say like what they're interested in and what they're hoping to find out.
Why did you request that in this meeting?
Sorry?
Why did you request the meeting?
Why did they request the meeting?
You introduce your tribe and I'll introduce my tribe.
I'm Alia, and I'm taking this, so I signed up for this trip because I wanted to learn. I mean, I have a lot of Muslim American friends, and part of my family is Muslim, and I wanted to get to know more about the culture in the United States and sort of think about a lot of the misconceptions that people have about the Muslim community in the United States.
Are all of you Muslim or?
No.
They're all non-Muslim except for Shariah and I, who are leading the class.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. So this is not a Muslim group.
No.
Okay. That makes some difference.
So we actually were brainstorming when we were eating lunch on the way here, what questions we wanted to ask you, and I think my question was about the role, like democracy, especially like in light of the recent Middle Eastern protests, and how democracy sort of fits in with Islam, because I know that a lot of like Western thinkers, like pundits, will say things like Islam is not compatible with democracy, etc., and that Christianity is, and like I don't really see how like one is more or less, and I actually don't really know all the facts. So I wondered if you could talk about how you see like government in Islam and like sort of like the idea of like a secular or not democratic movement.
Other people introduce yourself and why did you join this trip?
So how about we go around?
I'm Christy. I'm from Nepal, and I was primarily interested in this trip because I did a project for a class. It was on Muslim women, and I really got to like know different things about like feminism and women in general. And then, so I just thought I would explore this topic further, and this trip would help me do that.
And you're not Muslim?
No.
I would go really quick, yeah. I'm Shariah. I'm one of the co-leaders of the ASP group. And I was interested in teaching this class in order to show the students, and mostly non-Muslim students, different facets of Islam, and to really portray how different Islam can be practiced and how it can be perceived in America, and the struggles that Muslims face in America.
And this is a credited class?
Credited, yeah, a one-credit class.
Okay, so this is sort of, we have something similar to UCLA where, I forget what they're called, where students teach about their own Muslims in America, something like that. The MSA does. So this is that type of class.
So I'm Chris, and I was interested partly just because last year I was in South America. I was outside the U.S. and so I think I was thinking had more perspective on the U.S. and just how Islam is sort of getting connected to American foreign policy, and I feel like it's something I should know something about. So I took a class in the fall that was about Islam and like a religious studies class, and I was also interested in this trip.
Who taught the course?
His name is Azim Nanji.
Hi, I'm Josh. I spent some time studying social issues surrounding Islam, particularly in Western Europe and in France. And I didn't know a whole lot about the religion, so that's why I joined this trip. And to learn more about Islam and also the Muslim American community in the United States.
Hi, I'm Amaya. And I joined this group. I was in India over the summer, and I was in an area that was predominantly Muslim. And I just, it was the first time that I really started thinking about Islam and combined with sort of a feminist movement. And I was interested in understanding sort of the interplay of that dynamic between Islam and feminism and how it plays out in a westernized culture. So that's why I joined.
Yeah, I'm Desmond. I'm from Singapore. So I guess one of my primary reasons why I joined this trip is also on a personal level because I have a lot of Malay Muslim friends in Singapore, and so I have conversations with them, and I realized that Singapore has a very particular way of dealing, or the interaction of public policy and religion, in particular Islam in Singapore, is quite unique vis-a-vis, or compared with some of the other countries like America, for example. So I actually joined this trip because I was very interested in seeing how the formation of public policy, and that's actually my primary interest, my major, interacts with Islam, and maybe as a religion or as a social construct or community. That's why I joined this trip.
My name's Tarian. I was raised in a very small Christian town and had a very different, didn't have a quite big outlook on Islam. And I kind of joined this class to kind of see what the community was like in Stanford, and this idea of learning about a different religion with this text. And recently, I've become more of an interest of the movement of blacks back to being Muslim, and I kind of wanted to see the road, kind of get a sense of where I wanted to stand on religion and trying to maybe find where I wanted to be.
I'm Sarah, and I took this class because, one reason is because I'm from New York City, and there was a lot of controversy before I left about the Park 51 Sense Community Center. I wanted to hear more about people's perspectives, especially Muslims, and also because my best friend at Stanford is Muslim, and I was just very interested in her culture, and she just introduced me to a lot of things I didn't know, and I thought I would explore that more.
So I'm Dennis. I'm also the leader for the trip, and so one of the reasons I chose to teach this class was to help expose people to the Muslim American dynamics, and to help really dispel the misconceptions that people have about Muslim Americans and expose them to the political and social dynamics here in America.
I'm Josh. I'm studying Arabic and Middle Eastern history at Stanford, and I spent last quarter studying Arabic in Alexandria, and got a little bit of a sense of what Islam looks like in Egypt, and realized when I came back that I had very little idea of what it meant to be Muslim in the United States, so I just wanted to delve into that a little more.
That's awesome. I admire your dedication to get back when I was an undergraduate. I'm not sure if I would have ever joined the class that requires I take a trip anywhere. All the power to you. Well, the other side of the room, introduce yourself, starting with Zia.
Hi, I'm Zia from Saudi Arabia. I'm an SJD student at UCLA.
SJD is a doctorate in law.
And I'm doing my doctorate in Islamic law in public interest, the concept of public interest in Islamic law. under supervision of Dr. Abou
My name is Saeed Abdurrahman. I'm from Egypt, and I'm a PhD student here at UCLA Services Program, and my main research is about Islamic law and Muslim minorities. Also the provision of
Okay, I kind of already introduced myself, but I'm Dana. I was Professor Abou El Fadl student at the law school. I got my JD in May, and now I'm his assistant. This is Nora.
Skip over a silent.
This is Nora.
Nora's shy. I will introduce Nora for her.
My name is Nora. I'm Said's wife. We came here like 5 years ago, and it was interesting to to live in this community and meet other people who doesn't know the right picture about Muslims, and especially when you are a woman and you deal with them. So it was interesting for me to live here. That's it.
All of you know Grace?
So we introduced ourselves, but I'm from Palo Alto. I grew up in Palo Alto. Went to Palo Alto High School across from Stanford, and I'm Dr. Abou El Fadl's wife, and we've been married for 16 years. And actually, I'd been a Muslim. I converted to Islam the year before I met Dr. Abou El Fadl. So it was I just hit my 17-year anniversary, and learned about Islam when I was at business school at Cornell University, and so I am an American that became Muslim, so I totally understand, like, it's a very different dynamic, and it's very different to be convert also in challenging times.
Well, it's okay. So this helps orient me. Usually, meetings that like this are with groups of Muslims that are already have quite a bit of experience within the dynamics of Islam, and so the role that I play is quite different. This is interesting because it's sort of a mishmash of my role as a secular academic, law professor, and as also a jurist speaking from within the Islamic tradition. So I mean, it definitely has its unique position. I haven't taught undergraduates in a long time. The last time I taught an undergraduate class was at University of Texas, and I left undergraduate teaching because I had a universal reputation of being too hard. And so I enjoy teaching just graduate students. Are you mostly? How many here are juniors and seniors? So you're mostly freshmen and sophomores, right? Probably sophomores. Mostly. Okay. So this is even more so. You've just gotta come forth with your questions. I don't, in this capacity, I don't really speak to you from within a particularly authoritative role, other than just speak to you as a Muslim. So I would, the responses I give could be offered by Ziyad or Saeed or any Muslim for that matter. unless you're asking, technical academic questions about Islamic law or Islamic thought or something like that. I don't, I appreciate those who are not Muslim, and even for a lot of Muslims who grow up in this country and grow up in societies that are primarily not Muslim, that trying to already you show a level of cultural sensitivity or social sensitivity by wanting to know something more than what you pick up in public discourses about the Islamic tradition. But it is, it's, I can fully appreciate that it's a challenge to try to ferret out and make sense of this big label, Islam. I mean, imagine if you instead of Islam you just put any other word, Judaism. I mean, no one, I think, intuitively, just growing up in a culture that has more experiences with Jews than Muslims, you know that it's impossible to wrap up Judaism in a course or 2 or 10 or 20, and you just intuitively know that Judaism is a long span of history with various orientations and tendencies and schools of thought, and same with Christianity. I mean, imagine if you're in Egypt and someone, a group sits with you and says, "Well, explain to us what Christianity is all about." Whatever you say is by definition inaccurate and imprecise, and I think that's just the nature of all things human. Even Islam, religion that is rooted in the Abrahamic tradition. So when we talk about Islam, we talk beginning from Adam and Eve to Abraham, to the Abrahamic prophets, to Muhammad, to the post-Muhammad period, 1400 years of history, to more than 1 billion people in numerous cultural contexts and orientations. So you're talking about a phenomenon that's quite, I've been Muslim all my life, and I feel that I haven't scratched the surface of anything. Maybe when I was your age, I was hoping someday to reach a eureka point where I say, aha, and all fits in. Maybe. I don't really remember, but I think I had, moments like that of exuberance and so. But at my age now, I know enough to know that I don't know anything. You learn enough to realize that after you've read thousands of books and lived many experiences and so on, that just no matter what you learn, there's tons more. And this applies to not just Islam, but even my field of specialty, Islamic law, but everything in my life. American law. I'm a law professor in an American law school. I'd say that the longer I've been a law professor, the more I realize that the oceans that represent American proverbial oceans that represent American law are endless. thing towards Christianity or Judaism and so on. This is not a point of despair, it's a point of humility. The beginning of any point of learning is a level of humility. If Islam, if you look at this corner over there, you see a few piles of books. All of these books, this is my Islamophobic collection. These are the books that are sort of the bestsellers these days, and they're the ones that tell you, their authors tell you that they figured out Islam and they know it is an evil religion, or the truth about Islam. They're going to tell you what the real story is with Islam and so on. And it's fascinating because it's all of the Islamophobic books. You've read one of them, you've read all of them. They pretty much say all the same thing, while all the books that actually offer something useful, like the other books on the rest of the room, and the books that are downstairs, and the books in the outside library, and the books in my den, and just the thousands of volumes. You've read one of them, you feel that you need to read 100 more. And that's not something specific to Islam, but it's something that in our, all too often living in this society, we forget about Islam. It's quite baffling. Those who are sure what Sharia law is or Islamic law is, or those who think they know what Arabic culture is, or what Islamic culture is, or what the Muslim mind is, and so on. That tells me a lot about the limits, intellectual limits of these individuals and the actual topic that we claim to study. Generally speaking, people project their intelligence onto subjects they study, and the more intelligent you are, the more you will see your subject in shades and nuances, and the more modest in your acumen and analytical abilities, the more you will project a flattened picture of your subject. Put it bluntly, smart people see, when they study anything, they see complexity. Stupid people, when they study anything, they see a basic, fundamental message. And that's why also smart people, when you talk to them after writing a paper or after writing an exam, they're always, most often, if they're really smart, actually always, if they're actually smart, they'll be not sure about how well they've done things, and they say, this question is difficult, we try to answer this and say this. While stupid people are always very confident that they've done well, and they always get the most grades. This goes back to this topic of the Islamophobic. The thing about all these authors is that they think they know, and the thing that's common to all of them is stupidity and ignorance. They just and it's not because it's because they whether innately created this way or they don't learn much of themselves. It's just they don't see much complexity in what they talk about. I can understand an author who projects their limitations onto their text when they write something. But what I what I find very troubling is a reader that picks, that prefers or selects the stupid over the intelligent. That I find quite troublesome. So it doesn't speak well, I think, of our society that many of these books are hot bestsellers, and the authors make a lot of money writing idiotic things. While the rest, so many authors that write what we call academic works, usually nuanced and takes a very long time to write and very well researched and so on, are usually books that sell very little and read by class of specialized people. Other than just, I don't want this to turn into a message of despair, so I'll stop here and see what you hope to achieve from this reading. What can I tell you that would be useful in your studies or in your school or in your life? Or what can I tell you that would not be useful?
Very good point about describing what we really know. It goes back to these ideas of skepticism that we see in Montier and things like that. So, I mean, you have to keep questioning what it is that you know. But, I mean, you also mentioned something about the reason why these books are very good, I mean, they're bestsellers, and the reason is because, I mean, very flat or very plainer views of say, Islam, or any topic matter, for example, are also very central, therefore very readily accessible to society. So, I mean, during class, we actually watched a video of some I think about 6 months ago, there was some protest outside the Islamic Center during a gathering where there were people from Westboro and people from Orange County and so on and so forth were protesting Muslim Americans were trying to enter the Islamic Center. So, I mean, I know you mentioned right at the end that you don't want this to be a message of despair, but it is also true, and when we have some congresswomen come out and preach or talk in public, speak in public about very, very hateful messages to Islam. So, I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm despairing, but what can we do if we are a reasoned, intellectual community of individuals who want to get a message across, who want to get an advanced message across, but find it difficult when on the other side you have these people who just come out and say like, oh, Islam is evil, or Islam does this, and it sells very well because it appeals to a particular section of the populace. And what can we do?
Yeah, I mean that's a question I struggle with all the time. I if you just put my name in Google or whatnot, you'll find tons of articles that. With me, I call it, say, stealth Islamist or professor of fantasy, some, weird things. Basically, again, the same theme, that this is part of the Muslim conspiracy to take over the world, etc., etc. And, but here, there are a few things that are worth reflecting on. I don't know if I have any answers, but I might have useful questions. A few things worth reflecting on. I mean, part of our self-image in the United States is that this is a society built on religious tolerance. And this is part of the historical narrative of the U.S. But it's part of the nation-building mythology. But nation-building mythologies are sometimes quite dangerous because they make people acquiescent, in a self-congratulatory way. They pat themselves on the back for saying, well, we've achieved such and such value, or we've achieved the desired goal of moral standard, while the lack of self-critical insight makes them the embodiment of the very antithesis, the very opposite of that notion. So, the notion that the nation-building mythology that the United States is a society that embodied religious tolerance deserves being interrogated, and the extent to which, indeed, the United States can learn from other societies that don't have that type of mythology. So one of the things that has always been striking to me, I enter into these conversations quite often, whether, let's take for instance an American traveling to a country like Egypt. Quite often, the American will have the attitude, and this is, we're talking about the baseline. Quite often, not always, but often, it will be the attitude that, well, if there's anything to teach about religious tolerance, it's me who's going to be doing the teaching. While I think that I would submit that indeed, if a person is critical with themselves, then they will discover that they might have much more to learn from societies in which other religions have existed for centuries. So, for instance, that American-born, raised, etc., traveling to a country like Egypt might have much more to learn about religious tolerance than teach about religious tolerance. If you get, eventually some of you, it sounds like some of you already are interested in human rights fields and so on. This is something that plagues the whole field of democracy, human rights, feminist rights. There is an assumption, always by the culture or the civilization that is the economically superior and militarily superior, and this is just a historical phenomenon, is the equating of military superiority and economic superiority with cultural superiority. And going back from the days when the Romans thought that they have everything to teach to the barbarians and the Huns and nothing to learn from them. While centuries later we discovered that the civilization of the Huns or the Goth, for instance, the term Gothic comes from the tribal Goth who rebelled against the Romans in the famous Gothic Wars. We discover centuries later that maybe Gothic culture was far more interesting than Roman culture, and far more nuanced and complex and rich, or that Hun culture was definitely far more layered. This dynamic is redundant and repetitive in history. Every time a society rises economically and militarily, they tend to see the rest, the others, with a flattened picture, and which eventually catches up with the dominant civilization, sort of defeating it through its own ignorances. But it takes, of course, quite often a very long time. So the point is that even in fields of feminism or democracy and so on, you will often find that there's a standing assumption, quite often subconscious, unspoken, that it is we who are in the better position studying those who are in a lesser position. And that I find very problematic. So for instance, you said you're from Singapore. One of the things that I spent some time in Singapore, and I was found their approach to the whole question of religion quite fascinating and far more nuanced and complex than the American approach. In fact, I would say that the American approach can learn a lot from the Singaporean approach. Even the way they approached fanatic or fundamentalist Islamic groups was far more nuanced, but far more constructive. And you can take the Singaporean example and multiply it to so many situations. So part of what helps, I guess, is to ask why the hate. I mean, it's not true that Islam is a new phenomenon vis-a-vis the United States or the West. There's been a long history. And we notice this surge in Islam hating, or what now people call Islamophobia. And the popularity of books like this, which frankly, I mean, are not worth the money spent on them. I used to read them in, it's just a bad habit that I kept reading them on the hope that I'll read something new or something that I actually can learn from. But after a while, I just got so tired of it because there's nothing, absolutely nothing in there. So I stopped buying and reading Islamophobic stuff. But this rise, this surge in the legitimation of prejudice talk. I mean, imagine if someone would stand with a sign. Why actually say imagine? Just recently, we had at UCLA a Caucasian woman who appeared on YouTube. Saying some racist things about Asians and a rant about Asians, and the chancellor sent around a letter, basically saying we take. Now, when I compare what this woman said about Asians to what I've heard said about Muslims at UCLA, I mean, about Muslims is a million times worse. I mean, she said that something to the effect that, and I don't minimize her hateful speech, but it is a problematic when you find the chancellor of your university responding to one form of hate speech, but oblivious to another form of hate speech. When I was in law school, when I went to law school, it was not fashionable for Muslims back then to go to law school. Now there are a lot of Muslims in law schools, and every major law school has Muslims in it. When I went in the 80s, Muslims were still predominantly going into medicine and engineering and computer science, and not too many lawyers. And I had after the grades, after the first year of law school, which was very stressful, and people become very bitchy and annoying. After the grades came out, and people found out that this quiet Arab guy, who they dismissed as irrelevant, is at the top of the class. I had a bunch of messages put in my mailbox: "Go back home, you dirty Arab," "Go do this to your camel," or "Do that." And I still remember I went to the dean, complained to the dean. I still remember her name, Marshak. And he said, you have to be understanding. People are threatened, blah blah blah. 1 week after I talked to her, there was an anti-Semitic comment written by a student in a mailbox, and the dean issued the condemnation. Dean Marshak called the student assembly, and so and I actually went up to her and being a troublemaker, I said, I'm baffled by your lack of moral probity, which of course just be prepared if you say something to that like that to your dean to back it up with considerable intelligence and analytical and reasoning power, because you could find yourself before a disciplinary committee. I demanded to know why was it okay that I be told to go back to my freaking camels and while someone who drew the swastika and said, too many Jews of this law school was fundamentally offensive and intolerable. And, my point was not, and is not, and should not be, that it's okay to do the swastika. My point should always be for moral elevation, not moral denigration. And that is a point that I think many Muslims, as they deal with the issue of Islamophobia, must insist on and demand of themselves, not just of others. That the problem with Islamophobia is not that the problem is not unequal treatment. The problem is that it is a drop in moral discourse. No, so the other thing is that you go back and you ask yourself, okay, so why this hate and why the anxiety and so on, and of course in the United States we do have a history of as in a lot of immigrant societies, by the way, historically speaking, that the one group immigrates and acclimates and settles, and especially when they've competed hard to define their entitlements and sort of divide the pie, and then they're indignant and hateful towards any other group that comes in and wants to share the pie. So there's some of that going on. But I think there's something else, especially in the sudden rise of anti-Sharia legislations. I mean, 14 states are considering anti-Sharia legislation. I mean, it's fascinating because you think that there are so many Sharia experts. I can tell you that in numerous conversations, you're just struck by these people who are so adamant about passing anti-Sharia legislations, how ill-informed. I mean, it's not an issue of just like teaching them what the truth is. It's just getting them to even to understand something about the history of Sharia or anything about the whether for better or for worse. This is controversial. I mean, and I'm getting ready to leave tomorrow to a lecture in Villanova, so I can report how it goes when I throw in this thesis at the first opportunity I get. I think there's a lot of guilty and subconscious guilty conscience towards Muslims, especially in the wake of Iraq and Afghanistan, and I this is something I've noticed historically, and I started to suspect that it's going on here. When you're engaged in a war, I mean, it's the typical thing that you engage in. Human beings engage in a war dance, a hype where you demonize your enemy. But in an unequal war where you are slaughtering your enemy for a very long time, it is very difficult for the human psyche to continue a systematic process of denigrating or of denying the worth or the selfhood of the other without rationalizing it, philosophizing it. So take, forget today. I mean, observe, reflect on something just as simple and interesting in my view, and I find odd things interesting. That's true, but our culture vis-a-vis Native Americans. I'm just following the news about the launching of 100 Tomahawk missiles against Libyans and so on. Qaddafi's regime. Okay, what do we call certain symbolic constructs in our society by, like the Redskins, which is an offensive name in itself, or Tomahawk missiles? Have you ever thought? Have you ever pondered that? Why do we bring up the symbol of the American native, the Native American Indian, in the context of sports or war, which is a form of sports, if you control, if power is very unequal? What type of inherited cultural milieu and consciousness do we carry towards this element? You find the same thing in every. I mean, when you go back historically and look at some of the worst anti-Semitic cultural manifestations in history, you find that they are always in light of a continued state of violence with a very unequal state of power, where in the example I'm thinking of, the Romans fought a very unequal war with Jewish tribes and slaughtered them so often and for so long until they philosophized why it was okay to continue the slaughter of these people, and why each Jewish revolt was seen as such a fundamental threat to the Roman Empire. We see this now. Interestingly, we see a very different dynamic when Persians posed an actual threat to Romans. Here, it was not a discourse of hegemony and dominance. It was more a discourse of exaggerated mythologies. The way we talked about the Soviets when they were a threat. We didn't see the Soviet as fundamentally inferior. We saw we turned the Soviet into sometimes a larger than life threat. One final point about this: if you notice how people, well, here's this slide. I'm not sure you know this, but if you've read into about the history of slavery and slavery narratives, and how slave owners would eventually react to their slaves, or in societies that have maids and servants, again, the same power dynamic. Eventually, it's as if the human psyche ends up wanting to believe that these slaves did something or do something, or there's something about them that make them deserve their status, that their status is fundamental to their being, and so they ended up in this situation not because we all have committed aggressions against them, but it's because of, so for instance, there were a lot of, during the whole European discourse about whether slavery should be abolished, etc., there were a lot of books coming out about how these African people, they all slaughter each other, and it's in the barbaric nature of Africans for African tribes to fight each other and kill each other, and how these Africans enslaved each other anyway, and it was an intellectualized racism, very much like the form we see with Islamophobia, but fundamentally it grew out of this power dynamics that you don't want to confront the reality that you could the fact that even the thought that, well, through just different set of circumstance and history, and it could be me who is the slave and that slave who would be the master. So you want to believe that there's something fundamental to those who end up being victims. Same thing you find with maids and servants, and in today's cultures, people from Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or certain nations who supply an inordinate percentage of maids and servants. Notice the type of assumptions that start, or the type of philosophized bigotry that starts developing about those dominated, about Sri Lankan culture or about Bangladeshi culture or about Indian culture. I mean, whatever supplies the dominated. And I think there's a lot of that. I think that, we so far, there are between 2 million to 3 million people that we've directly or indirectly were involved in their deaths in Iraq. A couple of million in Afghanistan. A protracted conflict. How do you live with that unless you philosophize it somehow? And I think that's plus the phenomena of the native informer. The native informer is where it's like the early colonial settlers. They would always search for the self-hating Indian, right? The Indian who will affirm all their prejudices and suspicions about other Indians. So have you ever seen the pictures of Indian who will put smoking a cigar and wearing a cowboy hat, but is a Native American Indian, all other guys, or the self-hating black slave, the one who will talk about how all people of his race are lazy and so on. The same happens with Muslims. When those who dominate find Inoni Darwish or Hershey Ali or an Irshad Manji, or they become the affirmation of that. Maybe not only do these people deserve what's happening to them, but we're not bigoted after all, because look, they themselves have people from their own ranks that become informants, hence the native informant, that expression. They become informants about their own cultures and the deficiencies of their own societies, their own cultures, and they end up affirming our prejudices and our conceptions. I think that this is and I think this has nothing to do with if areas where periods of Islamic history where Muslims existed in a relation where the relation of empowerment versus vis-a-vis Christian or groups or Jewish groups, and you start finding the same thing developing in Muslim discourses. The fact that it occurs again and again doesn't make it right. It just makes it. It makes evil. As the banality of evil is also its redundancy. Just because we tend to repeat the same patterns of evil over and over, it doesn't mean that we should accept them. But to start addressing something wrong, you have to first unpack it. You have to attempt to understand it. There are a few people, maybe like yourself, maybe not. I don't know. Who I think are informed by counter discourse. I mean, so for instance, I write a book about Islam that talks to the common person. I wrote one such book, The Great Theft, and they'll read the book and say, "Aha! I used to think Irshad Manji or Hershey Ali is the right was the true representative of Islam, but now I read The Great Theft and I've changed my mind completely." It's possible, but that's not the common thing. That people normally. It is much more likely if you get people to understand the source of their anxiety, the source of their impatience, and the source of their own bigotry. Then you might start actually making a difference and countering these prejudices and so on. Anyway, well, one of the interesting things, think of, well, at least for the Muslims here, a lot of Muslim women, although they grow up surrounded by various models of Muslim womanhood, often you'll find that what ends up impacting your conscience and leaving an imprint, even as an insider to the tradition, are the image that strike that. Let me rephrase it. I often wonder, why is it so many Muslim women, although they might have grown up surrounded by various models of womanhood in Islam? I mean, they've seen the educated woman, they've seen the empowered woman, they've seen the woman who dominates her husband, they've seen the woman who's subservient to her husband, they've seen, they grew up in communities where, some, they hear of horror stories of wives who completely control their husbands, and other stories where husbands completely control their women. Why is it that what ends up lasting, impacting their psyche, is what affirms the dominant narrative? Why is it that they end up feeling that what they need to respond to is the threat of the dominated Muslim woman? Does this have anything to do really with the Muslim experience, or does it have to do with what type of gaze is placed by the public? So I know a lot of people from conservative Jewish communities in which definitely a Jewish woman grows up surrounded by models of patriarchy. Conservative Jewish groups where clearly the patriarchal male is the controlling one, the dominant one, or a context in which the rabbinic authoritativeness of rabbinic institutions are close to women, and including things like leading prayer and so on and so forth, or even as representatives of authoritative interpreters of the Talmud, so as Talmudic scholars, closed off again to women, and yet that woman will not grow up, most often than not, at least in the United States, does not grow up feeling that as a Jewish woman she needs to apologize for all the models of patriarchal dominance that exist in her community. She feels that, well, okay, they represent themselves and I represent myself, right? I mean, and if you talk to her and say, what's the deal with these with the way Jewish women are X, Y, or Z, she'll consider this offensive, because she'll say, why are you asking me to account for the practices of people I know nothing about and are not part of my reality? But now compare this to the consciousness of a Muslim woman growing up. Muslim women, and again you can ask Muslim women, don't take my word for it, do grow up feeling like they have something to prove. They have to prove that as a Muslim woman they're not dominated, they're not oppressed, they're not, they have to talk about how, we Muslim women are not. Does this have anything to do with the dynamics of Islamic culture or the Islamic particularities of the Islamic experience, or does it have to do with the hegemonic and dominant discourse that, or what I like the word gaze, sort of what microscopic view is imposed upon these Muslim women, so that as they're growing up, they constantly learn that in order to prove their worth, they need to represent Muslims as a bloc, which is it has much more to do with power dynamics than it does with actual doctrines or I mean, some of you already mentioned the thing about Muslim women. I've lived in Muslim societies all my life. My mother is a Muslim woman. My sister is a Muslim woman. My wife is a Muslim woman. I've had more students, Muslim women students, than I can remember or count. And I honestly tell you, I know nothing about Muslim women. Because I don't know what is a Muslim woman other than a woman who happens to be Muslim. I mean, I know what I think I know what my mother is, or what I can talk about my mother. I can talk about my sister. I think I know my wife. And that is always up to debate. Who knows if I know my students or not? A lot of them, as each student who's Muslim has their own thing. What can I? Then I ask myself, well, what can I say that's useful about Muslim women? I could talk about power dynamics in certain contexts, in certain societies, but to the extent that each Muslim woman is her own fully autonomous and fully worthwhile experience, that is in itself a fully legitimate manifestation of Islamicity, of the Islam that is in the heart and the life of this Muslim woman. And that cannot be summed up in any blunt or stereotypical way. I mean, the two of you all are Muslim women. In your own community, I mean, did you guys grow up surrounded with Muslim organizations or institutions or Muslim?
Yeah.
I mean, ask yourself in Muslim, how many families you know in which you'd say, God, the woman in this family is completely dominant. The man is sort of a little toy. Just does whatever it is, or complex models in which the man thinks that he's in control, but really the man is not in control. But it's, and yet intuitively, yet you don't grow up thinking that this is the representation of Islamicity. So then, whatever your view of Islamicity is, it's not derived from the various models that you know about your mother, your family, friends, so where does your conception of Islamicity come from? if it, at what point in your life did you pick it up and did you project it? Why isn't it? I mean, why isn't it a sufficient response that that you as Muslim women today, you're the ones leading this class, bringing men along on a trip, while you don't see the Muslim. I mean, why isn't that assigned to some Islamic factor, as opposed to, let's say, in an Islamic center where you find a curtain set up, so on. All of this just requires that it. I always tell students that there's a huge difference between the power dynamics, which are like fireworks. They put on a display, and they're very deceptive, and they give you a completely artificial picture and a real pursuit of learning, which then we start talking about, well, what are the parameters? What is it that you exactly want to learn? How do you define the topic? And if you learn nothing more from your class than that Islam is as varied and as complex as there are Muslims in the world, and as the many historical experiences within Islam, I think that's quite an achievement in itself. I don't think there is any key that you're going to master that will unlock Muslim secrets to you, because there are no secrets and there are no keys to these secrets. Anyway, any questions? Comments?
I actually have a comment. I think your example of the Muslim woman is an interesting one, and also applies to a lot of other examples of people, even if it's Muslim men or other minorities throughout history, that generally have this response where, well, I need to prove something to the opposing side, that what they're saying is not validated. And I was taking a social class, a gender studies class, which is interesting, and they attribute a lot of this sort of psyche to three main different, I guess, roots. One of them is like a micro level root, which is individual sort of internalization, or of the, the stereotypes that you've grown up with and the things that you've seen, you actually internalize them. And the second one was a meso level, which is interactional. And so how you interact with other people really starts to affect how you think. And even if you don't necessarily believe what the people are saying, you will interact in a certain way so that you're not perceived negatively. And then the last level that they had was a macro level, which is a really large structural organizational level in which you're influenced. So I think it's interesting to look at identity from those three perspectives. And of course there's overlap with them, and a lot of them contribute to how you think and how you respond to people. But to be consciously aware of what things are affecting me and why am I interacting in a certain way might be one of the most helpful ways in order to combat this sort of defensive or apologetic mindset that I think plagues a lot of Muslims. I'd say a lot of minorities. And minorities in general too.
It's, again, it goes back to this question of power dynamics, because the field of sociology is advanced enough, and anthropology, that we know that dominated groups internalize their domination, and I think we also know just from psychology that if someone who's in a position of power tells to someone who is powered over that there are, that often give an example that, if you're told you're stupid often, then you start acting stupid, and if you're told you're smart, you start acting smart. There've been a lot of psychological tests that done that conclusively prove that this is true. Groups of people that have been taken and treated as smart, they actually perform far more intelligently than groups of people who are taken and treated as. But the thing not tested for in psychology is how this internalization is even far more dramatic when coupled with power dynamics. Because it's one thing if someone who does not have power over you comes and says, for instance, you're so ugly, you're so ugly, you're so ugly. If you don't see this person as a source of authority, they might actually defy you to in ways that surpasses that. But if they are seen as in a position of authority or authoritativeness, then you start becoming the embodiment of what you're told you played out. And a lot of, they're definitely one of the biggest issues that I have with young Muslims and is that they completely fit into the role of expected of them when they engage in apologetics, because they immediately feel that they are accused and they need to vindicate themselves and they need to defend themselves, and frankly there are certain accusations by their nature are circular in their logical structure so that you cannot disprove. It's like the often given example, how many times do you beat your wife? No matter how many times you say, I don't beat my wife, your credibility is already gone just by the phrasing of the question. The minute you say, well, I beat my wife 0 times, you've lost the game, because you've accepted the parameters set by that who gives you the terms of the discourse. So, and to even bring this closer to mine, when someone comes, as often, someone will come and say, I want to work on Islam and women. Immediately, it's a completely meaningless topic. What does it mean to work on Islam and women? It's a perfect example of the way that we internalize prejudices and various assumptions that others give. And sticking with that example of Islam, students that say want to work on Islam, there are periods in role played by gendered individuals, women, in the early life of the Muslim community in Medina, and then a different role played by women of Medina and women of Kufa in the 20 years after the death of the Prophet, which was quite different from the role played by women in Syria 20 years after the death of the Prophet, which was yet now 100 years after the death of the Prophet. The role played by women in Syria is quite different from the role played by women in Egypt 100 years after the death of the Prophet. When you plug in certain facts, so for instance, when you learn that in 16th century Egypt, most lands that were privately owned were owned by women. Very few lands were actually owned by men, and that makes you wonder, how did that take place, and what does that say about that larger subject of Islam and women? or that professorial positions in the University of Damascus and Azhar University in the 12th century, it was far more common to have chairs occupied by chairs in Islamic law or Islamic theology or Islamic Islamics generally, occupied by women, and you know, so it's. And at what point can you lend yourself to a generalization, but yet think of the amount of pressure that is on us to accept these dumbed down categories. So if you go to a publisher and you say, you know, I want to write a book about Muslim women in Kufa in 9th century, the publisher will say, well, you know, I can sell about 100 copies of that book. If you write it, I'll price the book at, you know, $150 a copy. The publisher is pressuring you to talk about Islam and women. Imagine if ABC calls you and you say, well, I'll give you an interview, but I can only talk about women in the area, in the Ma'adi area of Egypt, or women who are graduates of American University of Cairo, but I cannot really comment about women who are graduates of Azhar University in Cairo. You know, that ABC reporter is going to say, well, thank you very much, move on to the next person who's willing to just talk about Islam and women, you know, that big, flat subject. Even professors and in your own, I mean, if you tell, or in, you know, as you represent yourself as an expert or as a student, you say, well, you know, I am, it sounds far sexier to talk about that I'm studying Islam and women than, you know, I'm studying some sub issue. This is, I mean, the more the more our sophistication about a subject becomes, the more our minds accepts qualifications. I mean, examine your own mind as you grow up. You know, the younger you are as a child, unless you're a particular genius, you know, you tend to want to see mathematics, for instance, in simple dynamics of addition and subtraction and maybe multiplication. But as your intellectual abilities expand, you start moving from various conceptions of what mathematics can be, and to the point that mathematics no longer need numbers. Mathematics can become something that dispenses with numbers altogether. And now take this in whatever you consider your own familiar context. I mean, if I come and I say, you know, write me a paper about you and your family, immediately you start thinking of individuals within your family, and then you think, is there anything that actually unifies these units? The more remote anything is, the easier it becomes to generalize about it. And that's why, you know, usually, as a rule of thumb, students who know less are always the ones who want to write the bigger topics. You know, students who, for instance, know very little about constitutional law, they'll come in and say, oh, I want to do a paper on American constitutional law. But students who actually know something about American constitutional law will know that such a paper is an F paper before you even started writing it. It is what part of American constitutional law? And even if you break it down to amendments, what aspect of a particular amendment are you talking about? I mean, Islam is imagine if a constitutional document, and I often say this to my students, imagine if a constitutional document that is 200 plus years old has is a level of, you cannot talk about this constitutional document without a million qualifiers to be, to even respect yourself at all. So, you know, you would need to qualify any thought about this constitutional document in terms of periods, in terms of sections, in terms of schools of thought, in terms of orientations, and so on. Now, imagine if you, instead of a constitutional document that's 20 pages or so, you take a text that inspired millions of people through centuries, like the text of the Quran or the text of the Bible, or even the poetry of Rumi. I mean, one of the things that I find fascinating and remarkable is that you'll find people not willing to generalize about the poetry of Rumi, people who have an appreciation of Rumi. You know, the minute you say anything about the poetry of Rumi, say, well, you know, you have to think about this, you have to... But they are willing to generalize about the text of the Quran as if it's a simpler text, or as if it is... that is the... You know, this is an introductory course. If your course does nothing else than tell you you should respect yourself, you should have enough respect, self-respect. You should have enough self-respect not to generalize about institutions that are as layered and varied and multidimensional as the humans who have embodied these institutions through the centuries. That's an achievement in itself. I mean, I don't know if it's possible to generalize about even Muslims living in our age. If examine the moment we are in, when and here someone who's lived you know, all his life as Muslim, I've read more books than I can count about various aspects of Islam and so on. The Muslims I meet in Indonesia, at different parts of Indonesia, and that even gets more complicated. The Muslims of Sumatra are very different than the Muslims that I meet in some other. I'm sorry, Indonesia. Sorry. Or the Muslims of Malaysia are quite distinct and separate than Muslims of Egypt. Even the Muslims of Egypt, they are of so many various orientations, and you know, some who are we right now have a constitutional referendum about some constitutional amendments, and the extent of nuance is mind-boggling. Or if you look at just you think about the Muslims of Libya, compare them with the Muslims of Tunisia, compare them with the Muslims of Bahrain, compare them with the Muslims of Yemen. The picture it constantly tells you that Islam is just you get the same message about all human institutions. That the story is that any generalization challenges the maker of the generalization more than informs the subject upon which the generalization is issued. And so, what texts are you reading? Anything for the book? For the course?
We mostly have small, like, online articles that we assign, or we'll just talk about them in class. One reading that we did have was from Esposito, which is Islam, the Straight Path. Yeah. And we had a couple of Rumi, like, poetry.
You had Rumi?
Or poems that we... Yeah, I'm a really big enthusiast when it comes to Rumi and Sufi poetry.
I'm impressed. quite often people, Rumi is the best-selling poet in the West, continues to be. But what's remarkable is that he does not fit with stereotypes of Muslims to such an extent that many of the people who study Rumi pretend that nothing in his poetry had anything to do with his Islamic identity and his Islamic character. While, from my perspective, it's laughable. I mean, I've actually read people who said, well, Rumi wasn't really Muslim. Rumi didn't really believe in God anyway. It's just mind-boggling. And talk about prejudice. I mean, when Rumi's, do you know anything about his life and his personal legacy?
He was a Sufi.
Well, yes, of course, but I mean, he lived. Rumi even studied Islamic theology.
He was a Hafiz.
Yeah, and of course he had. Yeah, he was a Hafiz. But his whole he's completely submerged in Islamic culture, and like a lot of the other Sufis, Hafiz as well, or Hallaj, or I mean they are very much a real embodiment of Islam as the way we think. In fact, in my view, Rumi is far more an embodiment of Islamicities, plural, than Bin Laden. Because Bin Laden experienced Islam within a highly politicized context. He was born in Saudi Arabia, he's confronted by a Soviet invasion that he feels very strongly about. He has a certain relationship with a royal family, and his dynamics with Islam, his relationship with Islamic culture, is extremely politicized and extremely a no holds bar game. I mean, it's a winner take nothing game. The very sharp, not very nuanced relations of power that Bin Laden grows up with. While Rumi studied various articulations of Islamic culture in a variety of contexts. I mean, he lives as a Muslim theologian for a while, he lives as a Muslim jurist for a while, he lives as a sort of a vagabond, one of the vulgar masses for a while, and then he meets his great master, who he considers equal the path to God, in his personal prophet to God, his Shamsuddin, which he directed all his poetry to, and so such a sophisticated and multi-layered intonations of Islamicities. And now imagine the irony and the obscenity of people talking about Bin Laden as a representative of Islamicity far more than they do of Rumi. I mean, Bin Laden might actually tells me far less about Islamic culture than someone like Rumi. Have you read Ibn Arabi, or have you assigned any Ibn Arabi? I mean, it's quite because there's a certain flattened Islam that grew up with the puritanical movement. The sometimes called Salafis or Wahhabi or whatever you want to call it. But it's a movement that the various historical nuances. So, and it's never a solution for someone who is well informed to say,